Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, November 29th, 2021, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. To my American listeners and those who celebrate American holidays worldwide, I hope you had a wonderful Thanksgiving, and I want to let you know right here at the top that I am grateful to you. I'm grateful to you for sticking with us these past, what is it now, like 7 years? Ooh, that's bananas. I'm grateful to you for, supporting the show in the many ways that you do, rating and reviewing it on iTunes, on Stitcher, on, Google Podcasts, on all the different platforms where you might listen to podcasts, purchasing Talk Nerdy merch from the Talk Nerdy merch store, and, sharing about it with your friends and family. And last but definitely not least, pledging your support on a per episode basis at patreon.com/talknerdy. Remember, I recently changed the tiers to make the show a little bit more accessible. So now if you pledge $2 or more, you are eligible for an ad-free version of the show. All you've got to do is once again visit patreon.com/talknerdy to learn more. I want to give a shout out to my top patrons this week. They include Daniel Lang, Mary Neva, Rob Schreck, Brian Holden, Christopher Pitts, David J.E. Smith, Dudas Infinitus, Frederick Fast Markison, Gabrielle Felipe Jaramillo Gonzalez, June Sapara, Leonard Prince, and Ulrika Hagman. I am so, so grateful for all of you. All right, let's dig into this week's show. So I had the opportunity to chat with a brilliant paleontologist named Dr. Larisa DeSantis. She's an associate professor in both the Department of Biological Sciences and the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences at Vanderbilt University. And her lab specifically focuses on research that really does combine a bunch of different disciplines to help understand the ecological and evolutionary responses that both extinct animals and also living extant animals have to climate change. So we're talking across time, across space. They look at modern evidence, they look at historic evidence, they look at fossil evidence to try and help understand and inform those working in the fields of ecology and conservation biology about how these organisms respond to climate change. We have a fascinating chat all about, everything from saber-toothed cats to Pizzly bears. Yes, you heard me, Pizzly bears. So if you want to know more, you've got to stick around. Here she is without any further ado, Dr. Larisa DeSantis. Well, Larisa, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks so much for having me.
I am super excited to talk all things paleo and grizzlies and saber-toothed cats and Pizzlies. What's a Pizzly? I'm so excited about this. Okay, so before we dive in deep, let's talk a little bit first about your background. So you're a paleontologist at Vanderbilt, but you study both extinct and extant species.
Yes, I do. And so initially, my interest in living animals or extant species was really just to get at the fossil animals. So, for example, if we want to reconstruct the diet of saber-toothed cats, we need to use various tools and techniques that we know work in the fossil record. So before we can even bring those tools back into the fossil record, we have to make sure that, they work with modern animals. So, for example, some of our early work looked at dental microwear to see if we could see differences in the diets between cheetahs, lions, and hyenas.
Okay, tell me what that word means. Dental what?
Dental microwear.
Yeah, what's that?
So great. So dental microwear is the microscopic wear patterns on teeth. And so essentially, we do like a little bit of paleodentistry. We will take a dental impression mold, just like you do at the dental office. We'll then make a cast of that tooth, and then we look at that cast under the microscope with all its glory and can see, microscopic wear patterns that have formed during the life of the animal. And, we know what cheetahs eat today. We know what hyenas eat today. So, for example, we know cheetahs typically avoid bone. They're eating largely flesh. We know hyenas are actively crunching on bone. They're scavenging. They're breaking open bone to get the marrow many times. And lions are sort of moderate in between these two. And before we can sort of assume that this method even works, we need to make sure that those microscopic wear patterns of cheetahs, lions, and hyenas actually correspond to what we would expect to see. And fortunately, they do. So in the case of cheetahs, we tend to see what's called well, I guess you can also equate it to sort of pits and scratches, but we've come a long way. We no longer sort of count pits or count scratches. We actually use a 3D method to actually make essentially like a topographic map of the surface, and then we analyze it in regards to different textural properties. So
Oh, cool. So almost like a forensic scientist might be looking at a bite marks or something like that of a potential suspect. You're looking deep into like all of the different textures of the teeth.
We are, and actually the confocal microscope that we use is also used for ballistic analysis. So looking at
cool.
the microscopic patterns that are left when a gun fires onto a bullet. So exactly. And through these different sort of textual properties, and there's two main ones. So one is called anisotropy. And so just a fancy way of thinking of the directionality of the feature. So imagine lots of scratches in one direction. So if you have lots of scratches in one direction and you are an herbivore, you're probably eating tough foods that sort of those scratches are resulting from shearing. And if you're a carnivore, it likely indicates sort of lots of flesh. And let's look at the other end member. There's another sort of textural property called complexity. And this is sort of a little more complicated. This is, imagine you are in outer space and you're looking down at the Earth. The Earth looks very smooth. Okay, so the closer and closer you get to the Earth, the more topographic complexity you're going to see. You're going to start seeing the mountain ranges and the valleys and the sort of the depth to the planet. Well, we know that relationship always exists. The closer you sort of zoom in, the more topographic complexity there is.
But right, because you're like improving your resolving power at that point.
Exactly. And whether you're looking, at the Earth from outer space, or you're looking at, the bottom of the ocean floor from, while you're snorkeling, the closer you get, the more complex it gets. What we're actually measuring is sort of the slope of that relationship. And so that's our complexity measure. So if things are really get complex very quickly, we're going to have high complexity values. And this equates to sort of hard object feeding. So hyenas have really high complexity and cheetahs tend to have less high complexity. And so by using these two different sort of metrics, we can actually characterize diet. And the really cool thing about it is it seems to work in all different groups of animals. So we can tell apart grazing horses from browsing bovids. We can tell apart, koalas from things that are eating more fruit or more woody material. We can use it in primates. We can use it in humans. And we can also use it in, bears and cats and other animals to figure out diet. So
okay, so basically, not only are you looking at sort of the direction of the grooves or the pits on the teeth, similar to the way a geologist might look at a meteorite to know how it entered the Earth's atmosphere. It's going to have like a directionality to it, but you're also looking at the difference between, the more resolving power I have, am I getting more and more detail, or is it kind of just smoothing out? And that sort of takeaway is how you're able to really identify. And I've long wondered this, honestly, because you hear this all the time in paleo. A new species discovered by one tooth, or we know exactly what this is because we have 3 teeth. And it's like, but you don't have any of the other bones. How could you possibly know what this animal is? But I guess the teeth really tell an important in-depth story.
Yeah, the teeth tell a lot. And so as far as knowing what species we're dealing with, that's based on tooth morphology. So the gross shape and sort of size of the tooth. And in mammals in particular, there's a lot of information in teeth. And that's because sort of they have, the mammals have evolved in many different ways, but diet has been a really key aspect of that. And so is tooth morphology. But if you handed me a dinosaur tooth, and let's say even for a moment I was a dinosaur expert, which I'm not, it's very difficult to actually distinguish species based on teeth alone in other groups of animals. So lizards or different, snakes and various things. It's very difficult. But in mammals, because of sort of the evolutionary history, we can often get at, show me a tooth and I can tell you what it is. In many cases, we can kind of get it down to family. Sometimes we can even get it down to species, depending on the tooth, depending on what we can compare it to. So there's a lot of information there. And then what I mainly focus on. So I let other people focus on the morphology and sort of describing species. What I often do is I try to bring these animals to life. I try to understand their ecology. What were they doing when they were alive? What were they hunting or what were they eating? And, diet is such an important part of what an animal does, their lifestyle. So diet can influence, where an animal lives on a landscape. It can influence sort of its movement. So you think about migration. It influences, is it in a forest? Is it in a grassland? Is it up in the trees? There's so many different aspects of diet and how that influences sort of habitat and lifestyle. It also can influence how an animal hunts, how it moves on that landscape. Is it sort of a pursuit predator? Is it chasing down things? Is it ambush predator? And it can also influence things like reproduction. So through the lens of diet, I try to, using tools like stable isotopes and dental microwear, I try to reconstruct what these animals are doing throughout their life when they were alive.
Okay, so we talked about the dental microwear, which is so funny because I keep thinking microwave when I hear that word, and I'm like, wait, what? Oh, where? Like WEAR, not WARE. I'm like, oh, like the pots you put in your microwave. So yeah, dental microwear, but you also mentioned stable isotopes. So let's talk a little bit about that because I'm remembering very clearly right now a podcast I did. Gosh, maybe over a year ago with Dr. Sora Kim, who used stable isotopes to study ancient sharks. And I can imagine that it's a somewhat similar process, yeah?
Yes, absolutely. So just like the work that Sora does, we also sort of drill teeth and can figure out what animals we're eating. And so in the case of herbivores, we can distinguish whether animals were eating grass or whether they were eating browse in some cases. So this is largely because of different photosynthetic pathways. And so you have so the way I like to describe it to some folks is I use kind of a car analogy. And so if you think of your standard automobile as your sort of standard photosynthetic pathway, it's useful. It's making energy. It's using energy. But if you think of sort of a hybrid, all right, your hybrid car, your electric car, as a sort of innovation, as a different type of photosynthetic pathway, it's really useful so aside from all the environmental benefits of having an electric car, it's really useful if you're limited on gas, or if gas is very expensive. And so similarly, if you're limited on either nitrogen or water, there's having this other sort of photosynthetic pathway can be really useful. And what it essentially does is it sort of captures some of that CO2 and then sort of later kind of convert some of that CO2. And so it's very costly energetically. So it requires a lot of what we call ATP. But essentially it can save you if you're limited on water or if you're limited on CO2.
And is this like a all the time thing or like a animal or organism is in distress, or I should say plant or whatever is in distress and, utilizes this strategy sometimes?
So that's a great question. So it's a all the time thing. So plants are either going to be C3 or C4. Some plants are even what we call CAM plants, which is a little bit different. But essentially, they're going to use one of these two different pathways. And one is much more costly than the other. But like our hybrid, it costs more to get a hybrid car or electric car sometimes. But it's going to save us in the long run, right?
Right.
That being said, if there's no benefit, if gas is, $1 a gallon, right, there may not be a benefit of a cost savings, rather, of getting that sort of electric car if gas is only $1 a gallon. And so essentially, if you are sort of if you're photosynthesizing using sort of the C3 pathway, that works best when you're not having to worry about when you're not limited for CO2, when you're not limited for nitrogen, when you're not limited for water. When you're starved for any of those things, then often C4 is advantageous. So long story short, we've had the advent of C4 plants since about 5 to 7 million years ago. And typically things like warm seas and grasses are C4, and typically things like trees and shrubs are C3. And so by using isotopes, we can actually figure out, okay, was that animal eating C3 plants or was it eating C4 plants? And typically the C3 and the C4 will equate to grass or browse. Now, that's not always the case. And that's actually why I got into microware initially, is I worked in Australia where you have C3 grass, you have C4 grass, you have C3 browse, and you have C4 browse.
Well, that's
And
confusing.
so to get any sort of headway on diet, you actually need both tools. They're very complementary to one another. So by using both tools, we can actually discriminate, was an animal eating the C3 grass or C4 grass? Was it eating C3 browse or C4 browse? And sort of really get a handle on diet. And in the case of carnivores, we can use isotopes to figure out what type of prey they were eating. So, for example, when we're looking at things like lions or cougars, we can see, are they eating prey that come from C4 ecosystems or from C3 ecosystems, from open habitats or from closed forests. And so that can provide us with a lot of resolution as to what the potential prey items are that they're actually eating. Are they eating grazers like horses and bison on the landscape, or are they eating browsers like tapirs and deer, for example?
And so why is this important to be able to look back at an organism, using this stable isotope and using this dental microware technology? Why is it important to be able to look back and say, I now know something about their behavior, not just about their morphology?
So, we can argue that, understanding our evolutionary history is important just for the sake of understanding our evolutionary history. That all being said, this is actually a question I wrestled with for a little bit of time when I was in college and embarking on graduate school. And at the time I was doing that, there were two different fields. There was a field of conservation biology and there was a field of paleontology. And, paleontology typically sort of was looking at, what were animals doing in the past, but not necessarily looking at it through a lens of a conservation lens. And conservation biology was pretty much exclusively looking at, how do we save species today? But since that time, these fields have really converged, and there's now a field called conservation paleobiology, which, as it sounds, actually uses the fossil record to ask and answer questions that are of direct relevance to conservationists. So that's often what I'm aimed at doing, is I'm trying to understand, what were animals doing in the past? Why did a lot of animals go extinct? Was it climate change? Was it human hunting? Was it a combination of these two events that caused their extinction? And also, what was sort of the biology of a lot of these organisms that lived and persisted on the landscapes for millions of years or thousands of years that can kind of inform us of what these landscapes were like and how these environments have changed over time.
Yeah, yeah. So it's not just about their sort of physiology or their behavior, but it really has to do with their interconnectedness with other organisms and with the planet as a whole, sort of like their ecology. How can we look at a single tooth, for example, and glean some information about how this animal or plant, well, I guess not plant because plants don't have teeth, but how this animal lived on the planet and coexisted with other organisms during the time when it was alive.
Yes, absolutely. And then ultimately, what made it vulnerable to extinction? Why might it have gone extinct? And also, what were the consequences of those extinctions on other animals that persisted after that extinction event? So, kind of why are the things that are alive today, why did they survive? Why did the things that went extinct go extinct? And are there sort of lessons learned that we can extract from the fossil record that can help us better understand how to conserve species today?
Can you sort of give us an example of like maybe an extinct species or, pattern that you've studied that has illuminated a little bit or that has led you now to study a living species and understand that sort of interconnectivity or that relationship? Or vice versa, something that you're studying now that's alive that in some ways relates to the sort of paleo aspect of your work?
Yeah, so that's a fantastic question. I was thinking there for a moment because there's so many examples.
Oh, cool.
I'll give you one here first, which is the quokka. So
Oh, I
there's a thing
love
called.
quokkas. Oh my God. They're
Okay,
like, hello. They're like the most photogenic animal on the planet. They're
they
so fun.
they are super cute. And what we so in this is just a very sort of specific example, but looking at quokkas, one of the things is today quokkas live primarily on islands. So there's a handful of quokkas that live on the mainland of Australia in Western Australia. But most of the quokkas numerically just live on these two islands. There's Bald Island and there's a place called Rottnest Island. And Rottnest Island is where you're likely to actually encounter them and see them and photograph them.
Like in the wild. Yeah, I've only ever seen them in like nature kind of reserves in Australia. Of course, places where they're sort of caring for quokkas. But yeah, I've never seen them just sort of in the wild.
Well, the way that they're able to live on these islands, essentially, we think, is because foxes never made it to these islands. So you have an invasive species that was brought over, foxes, by Europeans. And these foxes and other things like cats and even other herbivores like rabbits have really wreaked havoc on the ecosystems in Australia. And in particular, you have, foxes which can hunt and kill quokkas. And so where quokkas live in Western Australia today, where they co-occur with these foxes, they only live in these really sort of dense environments, right? There's like when we looked at their isotopes, we found that their isotopes are really negative. It looks like they're eating vegetation in the densest components of that ecosystem. But when they're on the islands, they're actually eating from more open environments. And this may indicate that maybe they're doing something different on the mainland or the islands. But what we ended up doing is we went sort of back in time. We looked at fossils from, around 20, 30,000 years ago from mainland Australia, the same region where we find them today. And we looked at those quokkas. And what we actually find is that they're found in much more open ecosystems in the past. So this is really important because this tells us that if we can eradicate foxes in this particular area, then we don't have to sort of manage for these dense sort of shrubby areas. In fact, they really do prefer sort of a mosaic ecosystem and can live in a variety of different environments. They just can't live or coexist with foxes, which are an invasive species and also an invasive predator to them.
Oh,
And
wow.
so
So we have an actual like action-oriented takeaway from this data. We actually know how to engage in conservation efforts today because of this information.
yes, exactly. So that's a very specific example. And then there are other sort of more general examples where, we're trying to look at, what are the animals that went extinct, or how did these animals respond to changes in climate? And are there things that we can learn? So is it the generalists that fare better? Is it the specialists that fare better? What are the sort of commonalities? And so, few things that we've learned from looking at various fossils, whether it's, in Australia or North America, is that when it gets very dry and arid, the things that can't sort of live in those ecosystems don't do as well. And one large phenomenon that you often see is that browsers seem to be disappearing. So browsers are things that are eating mainly leaves and eating from forest ecosystems. And as you can imagine, as it gets more arid, as the climate is changing, that these browsers may have a hard time sort of living in these different ecosystems. Or, various predators, as things are opening up and drying out, may have a difficulty hunting animals if they're unable to sort of ambush them from forested environments. So as these environments change, we are seeing that is having an impact on different species. And essentially, as an animal or as a species, you can, move. So move north in the case of warming climates, or move in some other way, move, adapt, so do something different, or you go extinct. And so we're trying to sort of assess what happens, by looking at sort of instances of warming in the past.
It's fascinating. What incredible sort of like detective work. Do you ever feel like you are sort of like a nerdy detective, like a geeky science detective that's able to uncover some of this cool stuff that you'd never be able to know without all of this evidence and all of these clues sort of adding together in this way?
Oh, I do. Absolutely. It's so fun to, be at the museums and sample the teeth, whether you're drilling them or taking molds. And then, you just kind of get addicted to the data, like what's happening. So once you put it under the microscope, you have to see the scan. You have to then analyze it. You have to look at where it falls. And you want to see how that process unfolds. And, sometimes we're right and sometimes we're really wrong. And that teaches us, nature works in odd ways, and it's, sort of our job just to kind of try to work through it and understand what's happening and learn from it.
Yeah. So, that sort of leads to an interesting question, one that maybe is not just, I want to ask to satisfy my curiosity, but in case anybody who's listening is thinking to themselves like, I might want to be a paleontologist. I have no idea paleontologists do all this stuff. What is a sort of typical experience like for you? Because you mentioned being in the museum, but I know you're also sometimes in the field and sometimes you're looking under the microscope. So you're in the lab. Like, who knew paleo wasn't just walking around with a pickaxe in your backpack, but it's actually, all these different aspects of investigation. So what does your workday look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. So during the summers, I'm often away either in the field or at museums, but more of my work actually relies on specimens that people have already collected. So I like to think that I'm bringing a second life to these specimens. So people have already sort of gone out in the field, collected them, noted what kind of animal they are, described them, noted the age of the locality. And now I come in and I sort of look at these specimens, and I often need a certain number. So there needs to be, enough thylacines or enough Tasmanian devils or enough, whatever the animals, saber-toothed cats. And then I go in and I'll actually either, sometimes I'll non-destructively sample them. So sometimes you just photograph them. Sometimes you measure them. You're measuring the jaws. Other times we're taking molds. So I use lots of Q-tips. I clean the surface of these teeth with acetone. I'll apply this dental impression material, take molds. And then other times I feel like I'm a dentist. So I'm drilling the teeth. I'm actually collecting a little bit of their enamel and collecting it in little vials. And then all of that material, so whether it's, little bits of enamel or whether it's the molds from the teeth, I bring those back to the lab, to Vanderbilt. And so during the academic year, when we're teaching, when students are here, those days we're basically sort of analyzing all of the data that we've actually collected from the museum. So we get to do a little arts and crafts. We get to make casts and play with putty and make an exact replica of these teeth. And then we look at them under the microscope, which we have here. And we also do different sort of chemical preparations. So we clean the teeth, we clean that enamel. We make sure that we've removed certain things like organics and whatnot, and we prepare it for analysis on a mass spectrometer. And so essentially all of those things we do are kind of in the lab throughout the sort of work day or school day. And lots of students are actually involved in that process. And so, many times students will kind of start in the lab engaging in that. And then at some point, we then bring them out to the museum and kind of show them where that process begins. So yeah, as a paleontologist, you can go out in the field and find primary fossils. You can look at museums and ask and answer questions based on specimens that already exist in the collections. And you can also look at databases and not travel anywhere and just kind of pull data from things like the paleobiology database or Neotoma database and ask and answer questions using data that's been accumulated. So there's so many different ways. And what I really like about it is it's very accessible to so many different people of different backgrounds. And also, if you have a disability, then, these are also things that you can do. You don't have to be in the field. You can engage in paleontology in so many different ways, shapes, and forms.
Yeah. So, I think historically, or at least way back when I was in college, I remember, being excited by the concept of paleontology, but most of the universities that were near me, in order to sort of go the paleo route back in the day, it was very geology focused. Like there weren't really many undergrad programs in paleo. So people would usually study geology and then eventually switch over to paleo. And I felt like it always had this sort of like, overarching theme of like, you better like rocks because you're going to be learning a lot about rocks. And I was like, but I want to do like anatomy and comparative anatomy. And there have always been these like schools that studied zoology or anatomy in an effort to sort of like link up to paleo. I'm wondering what your sort of path has been, because I know a lot has changed since then. And there are a lot of different roads that lead to an advanced degree in paleontology.
Yeah, so my journey is pretty unique in the sense that I did not grow up thinking I was going to be a paleontologist. I will say I did grow up curious about science and nature, and I will say that taking classes at the Los Angeles Museum of Natural History over the summer on, whether it was robots or snakes or dinosaurs, obviously contributed to my sort of fascination for science. But I was so I guess to get a little bit more personal. So when I was a child, I had epilepsy and I had between 30 to 40 seizures a day. And I was actually also the national poster child for the Epilepsy Society. And so that experience, sort of meeting with people in Congress and a former president, sort of got me really engaged in the political process. And so if you had asked, the 10-year-old me what I wanted to be when I grew up, it was a congresswoman. So I went from, dog walker to congresswoman. And, that was sort of my path. And so I actually went to the University of Chicago my freshman year and was sort of dead set on, going to law school, becoming a politician, trying to sort of make things better for folks. And, I'd advocated for the Americans with Disabilities Act, which has had such a huge impact on people. That was sort of my life trajectory. And, just the way things unfold, I think, being in college, there's so many new classes and things you don't necessarily even know about until you get there. And it was literally a random circumstance. So at University of Chicago, you have to take a year of physics and a year of bio and a year of language. And there's this whole core curriculum. And I was in my bio sequence and I had loved ecology and evolution. That was my first quarter class. That was great. And I loved anatomy and physiology. And that was fantastic. So then there's this third class. It's immunology, and nothing against immunology, especially in our COVID world. But it was taught by an instructor who I don't think had ever taught this course before, had no assigned textbook. And so if you couldn't follow him in class, you just had no resource to go to. And I remember thinking, am I going to pass this class? This is so, I didn't follow the first lecture. Things were not looking positive. And as I'm walking out of that class, a friend of mine said, oh, there's this paleobiology class being taught. You want to go check it out? I said, well, yeah, sure. That sounds fun. So I sat in on the lecture, and everything I loved about political theory, I was finding in evolutionary theory, and it was just completely captivating. And I was instantly hooked. And actually, within a week, I ended up volunteering in the lab to, prepare dinosaur bones. I was, really fascinated by this new field of paleontology, or new to me rather, and was sort of not sure what I wanted to do. And long story short, I ended up transferring to UC Berkeley, where I majored in resource management, which is also sort of like environmental management. And I was taking all the paleontology courses at the same time, and I was really having to wrestle with, do I want to selfishly study the ancient past because it fascinates me and I find it so cool and interesting? Or am I going to try to conserve and try to study conservation biology or do land management and try to actually make an impact on these environments today? And that was a really hard decision to make. And I actually tried really hard not to be a paleontologist. So I kind of pushed paleo aside and said, well, there's not too many jobs in that field. I'm going to go into environmental management. So I did. I went to Yale's forestry school and was pursuing a degree, a master's in environmental management in conservation biology. But I really missed the paleo. I missed the discovering of ancient animals and ancient creatures and the mystery. And I missed it. I really missed it personally. And so I was also really fascinated and excited and passionate about education. And so I probably had one of the coolest jobs ever. And so I know you can't see me, but if you need to picture me, you can picture Miss Frizzle, right? So I very much look like Miss Frizzle. I've got her hair. I've got, I've got her personality maybe in some way, shape, or form. But essentially, after I finished my master's, I took a year and I drove a 38-foot Winnebago with dinosaur exhibits around New York City for the American Museum of Natural History. And this is for their movable museum program. And that was just such a cool job. It was, educating folks about dinosaurs, bringing them to different communities. We had lots of students who were unable to see or unable to hear, who were able to interact and engage with the exhibits in different ways. And so it was really just an amazing experience. And I love the education. But again, I sort of missed the research. And so finally, I've got these degrees from mainly sort of a biological standpoint, resource management, conservation biology. And I decided I was going to go for it. I was going to go for the PhD. I was going to try to be a paleontologist, but I was going to try to integrate all these different fields. And so, fortunately for me, it was completely serendipitous. I go to the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology meeting, and the potential advisor that I'm interested in working with, Bruce McFadden, actually had come up to me and had read an abstract I wrote about education in the movable museum. And, I was instantly hooked as to his research. He was looking at sort of forest environments through time. I had done a lot of forestry. It sort of linked together all of these different areas. And he was very supportive of me doing education outreach as part of my graduate career. And so
Which is
ultimately,
so important.
yes, absolutely. And it's not everyone is supportive of that. Some folks are
No,
just sort of
not at
like
all.
research. And, he allowed me I was in a program called SPICE, which was a program. NSF used to have what are called GK-12 programs, where instead of TAing in a university setting, although I did do that in my graduate career, we actually TA'd in a public school classroom. So we brought lessons to, the 7th grade classroom in Gainesville and actually taught them about paleontology and fossils and also about physics and their whole curriculum of science during the academic year. So so I and then at University of Florida, I was in a zoology department. And so there we were, I happened to study fossils, but those were just my organisms, right? I studied ancient life, but I studied life. And so I really came to it from much more of a biological standpoint, where I think the questions I ask are essentially biological. But the tools and the things that I use are often geological. And so, kind of combining these tools. And ironically, when I was first hired at Vanderbilt, I was hired as a biogeoscientist. So, kind of linking all of those things together. And I was actually in an earth and environmental science department, which used to be a geology department. And now I'm actually have a joint position where I am primarily in a biological science department, but I'm also secondarily in an earth and environmental science department. And so, I think it's so interdisciplinary, and often it's the university's historical, how it was set up. So at Yale, paleo is mainly through geology. At Berkeley, it's mainly through biology or integrated biology. And so, but really it involves geo and bio. So whether you have a passion for the rock side of it, or if you have a passion for the organisms themselves, the anatomy, the physiology, or the ecology, ultimately you can sort of link those tools together and bring these fields together. It really is interdisciplinary.
Yeah. So, it's interesting because utilizing these different interdisciplinary tools that you develop throughout your undergrad, throughout your graduate training, and of course, just your sort of on the job training as you do as an academic, you now are asking some pretty big and important questions about organisms that are actually alive today and how those organisms are being affected by these human induced changes. And so I wanted to make sure, it's so important that we don't run out of time to be able to talk about specifically some of the work that you've been publishing recently about polar bears and about grizzly bears, which could be interesting. But even before we get to grizzlies, just the idea of what is happening to polar bears because of our carbon emissions because of our inducement of a changing climate?
Yeah. So while initially a lot of my work was focused on studying the modern to understand the past, there was a point where we began sort of switching, and a lot of our work recently is really focused on the historic past. So using these same tools and techniques to assess how diets of polar bears have changed over time. And so that's essentially what we were looking at is, polar bears are these hypercarnivorous animals. They rely on hunting seals from sea ice, and that sea ice is melting. And with global warming, with climate change, you're seeing the melting of the sea ice, which is impacting their ability to effectively hunt. And one really interesting thing about polar bears, if you compare a polar bear to, say, a grizzly bear, is that polar bears have an elongated skull and they have really large canines, but they actually have reduced molars. Their molars are smaller than a grizzly. And that just kind of demonstrates that they really have changed their skull so that they can really kind of reach into these ice holes and hunt these seals, because seals have to come up for air, right? They're mammals. And when they come up for air, the polar bears are well positioned to, get their dinner and hunt those seals. Now, with the sea ice melting, we're really sort of reducing the ability of these polar bears to effectively hunt prey. And so they're now having to look for other food sources. And there are other folks who have studied sort of the change in their diets in regards to now we see polar bears eating more seabird eggs, or one thing that we can also observe is that they're often scavenging on more bowhead whale carcasses, and they're trying to find meet their caloric demands any way they can. And so what our question sort of was how has the diet of these polar bears changed over time, and have they in other times of warming have they sort of changed their diet, or are they hyper specialized? Not only did we look at polar bears over the last 100 plus years, but we also looked at polar bears during a time called the medieval warm period, when it did get pretty warm pretty quick. And that was about 1,000 years ago. And what we ultimately found is that these polar bears sort of are hyper specialists. They really don't change. They eat soft things. They're really well adapted to, eating, taking these seals, hunting these seals, and eating the blubber, eating the flesh, eating the soft parts, right? They're not crunching on bone. They're not breaking open the bone to get at the marrow. And there may actually be a bit of a biomechanical constraint here. So because they have this elongated skull, they actually lose power, essentially, in being able to bite hard things with the elongation of the skull. So if you have a shorter skull, you can actually often have, exude greater forces when you bite. And so things like grizzlies can eat tubers, and they can scavenge, and they can eat pretty much whatever they want or whatever they come across. The polar bears are sort of less well suited for that. So we were sort of trying to assess, do we see a shift in diet? And what we ultimately saw is there's an inkling that there may be a shift in diet happening very recently. But overall, these bears are hyper specialized and have sort of maintained this hyper specialization over time. And so this is actually a concern, because
So even in the sort of paleo record, like the most recent polar bears that are, no longer with us, still were sort of eating this way.
Yeah, so even about 1,000 years ago, during the medieval warm period, they were, sort of eating soft things. They were eating blubber, they were eating flesh. They were, likely hunting the seals from the sea ice just the same as they're doing today.
Right, so they're not likely to switch gears anytime soon.
Exactly. That is the main point. So, it makes us concerned, because what we do know about specialists, and, one of my favorite all-time specialists is a saber-toothed cat, right? So you have elongated teeth, you're a big animal, you are specialized on larger prey, and those went extinct, right? And so we do know that specialists are more vulnerable to extinction, or can be more vulnerable to extinction, if the environment or the climate changes in a dramatic way, which is what we're seeing today.
Yeah. And so, we see all of these, terrifying images of sickly and starving polar bear. They've sort of become a poster child for the melting sea ice, or land ice too, but for the sort of treachery of climate change at the poles. And, I think a lot of times this kind of imagery is it's important. I think it's obviously utilized in order to get people to act. But how do you respond, or how does that relate to this kind of work that you're doing? Like, are you having those same kinds of concerns that like polar bears may not make it?
Yes, so absolutely. So the other reason why polar bears are so important to sort of exemplifying what's the consequences of climate change is the fact that polar bears live so far away from most of us. Okay,
Right. Yeah.
so
Most of us have never seen a polar bear
most of
except
us
in
have
a
not seen a
zoo.
polar bear in the wild.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah. Yeah.
and so you can imagine sort of your local ecosystem. If they build a strip mall across the street, or if they build a housing development, you can imagine how that might impact the local species, right? It might have an impact on their habitat. It might fragment it. You can envision those impacts, but what's happening with the polar bear is essentially they're not dying out because of habitat fragmentation. They're not dying out because of human hunting. Essentially, they are declining because of climate change, because we are emitting so much CO2 into the atmosphere that we are warming our world. And overall, it's contributing to the melting of the sea ice. And so our impacts, whether you're in Tennessee, in California, across the globe, anywhere, are having an impact in these polar regions. And so that's also why they're so important. And I am concerned because what we have learned time and time again from modern ecosystems, from fossil ecosystems, is that apex predators are really key to the stability and the functioning of ecosystems. So, for example, this is why wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone. Is you have all of these elk and deer and various things that are really over browsing some of these environments, that are wreaking havoc on these environments. And so the wolves actually created more of a stabilizing effect, allowed them to sort of predate and reduce the number of elk, for example, in that ecosystem, and allow for a more sort of a healthier ecosystem, more resilient ecosystem when you have an apex predator that lives in that ecosystem. So ultimately, I fear us having an Arctic without an apex predator, or an apex predator like the polar bear, and that is a concern.
And so when we think about these sort of natural pressures, right? That's really what we're talking about when we talk about the potential for natural selection, is that there are these pressures, these environmental pressures. Sadly, sometimes they are human induced. Very often they are just based on, natural shifting climate or natural changes to the environment. But of course, ever since we came on the scene, most everything is due to, this intense and sort of overbearing human impact. But ultimately, when we talk about sort of the pressures, the natural selection pressures that are put on these different organisms, what ends up happening? They adapt, or they die off, right? They're able to figure out a new strategy to stay alive, to eat, to pass on, traits to their young, or they die off. And so, of course, there is a legitimate risk here that we will lose our our polar bears, because they no longer have a place to live and to hunt. Is there a chance that they could adapt, given that sort of the shape of their head is what it is? They're already specifically sort of built to eat this kind of soft food. Could they change their dietary strategy? Could they, what are some of the potential outcomes here?
Yeah, so this gets really interesting and also sort of really speculative pretty quick, but also fascinating at the same time. So, one of the consequences of climate change is that polar bears are actually retreating further inland during different times of the year. And actually, grizzly bears are moving further north because of warming. And so now grizzlies and polar bears are coming into contact more frequently than they did before, and sometimes engaging in opportunistic mating. And this is actually producing a Pizzly. And a
Like, for real,
Pizzly,
this is actually happening?
Yes, yeah. So there are Pizzlies. The first Pizzly was discovered in 2006 when a hunter actually shot a polar bear, what he thought was a polar bear, but it looked a little different. And so when they looked at the genetics of it, they found that it was actually a hybrid. It had a polar bear mother and a grizzly bear father.
No way. Okay, wait. There's so many questions I have, but before we dive fully into them. So this hybridization happened naturally. So this wasn't induced. It wasn't, done in a zoo or by a unscrupulous breeder. These were two organisms that stumbled upon each other and were like, hey, good looking. And so a hybrid between a polar and a grizzly, how genetically far apart are they? Are their offspring viable? Do we know the answer to that question?
We actually do. So
Okay.
they can produce viable offspring. And in fact, there have been other bears that have been tested that look like they are a product of a Pizzly mating with a grizzly. And so
Cool. So this could be a whole lineage.
potentially. So we do know that over time, we have seen sort of this happen before, at least evidence via genetics shows us that, grizzlies and polar bears have come together in the past, but they're also not that distantly related. So they sort of split about 500,000 years ago. So they have a common ancestor. And because of that is likely why they're able to produce viable offspring. It's unlike, sort of a lot of different combinations that produce sterile offspring or don't produce anything at all. But in fact, these are producing sort of viable and fertile offspring.
Cool. Okay, so we've seen a historical record of this happening. We see even today a few spotty examples of this. Of course, the reasoning behind it is quite tragic, but it also goes to show that sort of very Jurassic Park takeaway that life finds a way. Do you see this being sort of a random one-off thing that continues to happen, or do you think this may be sadly the future of this species?
So it's hard to know, and it's hard to be too optimistic right now because normally hybrids are less well adapted than either parent species is to their environment. So, I mean, this makes a lot of sense, right? A grizzly is going to be better than a Pizzly within its environment. A polar bear is going to be better than a Pizzly within its environment. And so typically hybrids, there isn't an advantage to being a hybrid, right? It's a disadvantage because you're less well suited to that particular environment than either of the parent species. Now, that being said, as our world is changing, as the Arctic is melting, if we start to see an increase in these opportunistic mating events between grizzlies and polar bears at bowhead whale carcasses, again, for very sad reasons, there is a possibility that Pizzlies may confer benefits to say polar bear as in a warming Arctic, right? As sea ice is melting, as these animals need to be able to be more opportunistic, as they need to be able to potentially not have such a high caloric requirement, as they need to be able to eat different resources. It may be a potential answer, but again, it's a big if, and there's a lot we need to learn about these animals. But there has been some really cool work that's been done, actually in a zoo, where they actually studied Pizzlies.
So often we think about life on Earth as being somewhat static. We know it's not, but because of our sort of time period that we exist in, we're only looking at a cross section of time. We know that speciation is a sort of gradual process. We know that very often a new species evolves because of some sort of mutation that confers an advantage to the organism. Makes it more have higher fitness. Blah 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 blah. But could a hybridization event like this be us observing speciation in process? Like, is this often or ever identified as the start of a new species?
So hybridization usually results in sort of a bringing together of two different species, right? So you tend to, it's not necessarily a mechanism for generating new species
Right.
frequently,
Yeah.
but you do tend to see what's called integration, where some of the genes from one species sort of begin to make it into the gene pool of the other species, right? Through these sort of mating events.
Could this be a speciation event, or is it more likely that, I'm just thinking out loud, when a species, very often we look at the fossil record and we think, okay, this species is identified as a new species because there was some sort of like mutation or something that ultimately led it to have these traits that conferred an advantage. But is hybridization ever the sort of spark for a new species?
So I don't, hybridization is probably a less common cause. I mean, so we could have a whole debate on what is a species, right? And
Yeah,
actually,
yeah.
based on the biological species concept, a grizzly bear and a polar bear would not be two different species, because the definition of a biological species concept is things that, when they reproduce, that if two things can reproduce with each other, that they are the same species. Now,
Right, like
that being
dogs and wolves.
Right.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
then there's the morphological species concept, which says these things are pretty darn distinct. And so we would treat them as separate species. And they are. I mean, a polar bear is very different from a grizzly bear in the way their niche, their environment, the way they hunt, everything. And so, essentially they are two species. But yes, absolutely. Can we see sort of speciation in action? I think there's a lot of cases of that. And it mainly comes from sort of isolation. So I think, the dingo, right, is actually Canis lupus. It's a wolf, but it lives in Australia, and
Yeah.
it's not making its way back, onto to other parts of the, continental world aside from Australia. And so essentially you're seeing sort of evolution in action, right? So a million years from now, the dingo will probably be very distinct, and it's considered its own species from the wolf, for example. And there are other things like that where you would expect isolation is causing sort of evolution in action to sort of to happen in many cases.
Yeah, we've got chimpanzees and bonobos, for example, where we kind of can identify that these things are pretty dang different behaviorally. They're different well, not terribly different geographically, but still distinct geographically. But for years, they were called just like pygmy chimpanzees because it's like, well, it's like the same thing. They're just diminutive. But yeah, it's like, where's that dividing line? Just because something can mate, doesn't necessarily mean that it's the same. I don't know. It's always fascinated me, this idea, and this kind of goes to a larger debate as you referenced. I recently had Lulu Miller on the show talking about her book Why Fish Don't Exist, and a big part of what we discussed was this idea of taxonomy and categorization, and that the lines are always much more blurry than we want to think, and that all of these different ways that we categorize are constructs. They're human induced. It's like based on the evidence that we have to say this fits in that bucket and that fits in that bucket. But sometimes things fit in two buckets.
Yep, absolutely. Yep.
That must be sometimes frustrating and sometimes very freeing as a paleontologist, as an ecologist, as a biologist, to grapple with these things because they're so important for kind of developing theories and for publishing and just being able to speak about these ideas, but at the same time, I guess holding on to these concepts lightly because they really are so plastic.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I try to use tools that are called phylogenetically independent. So, what plants you eat, or what prey you're eating via isotopes or via microwear, whether you are called species A, B, C, or D doesn't really matter. We're trying to sort of reconstruct their ecology, and sometimes that taxonomy, or what an animal is called, does change. So a really sort of recent and classic example is Canis dirus, so the dire wolf. So dire wolves are real for any of the Game of Thrones fans. And it was referred to as Canis dirus. It was thought that it was related to, closely related to coyotes and wolves. And essentially you have Canis latrans and Canis lupus, which are coyotes and wolves. And so it was named Canis dirus because there were a lot of similarities morphologically. But through some recent genetic analyses, they've been able to reassign it to Anacyondirus, which is a different genus. And so, does that change how we interpret its ecology? Not really, actually. It is sort of, we're still interpreting the ecology based on the isotopes, based on the micro. We still think that they were, hunting from, these sort of open environments and taking down large prey and eating things that were grazing. But we now call them something different. We don't call them Canis dirus. We still call them the dire wolf, but we call them Anacyondirus. And so that reflects their evolutionary history. So often these things, it's very nice to kind of, other folks are working on the taxonomy side of things, and we're working on the ecology side of things. And sometimes when we make those sort of little course corrections in taxonomy, things become clearer, and sometimes they become weirder. And you're like, oh, wow, that's weird. So this evolved multiple times and that thing isn't closely related. And, there's all sorts of cool examples. Like there's a marsupial saber-tooth that I won't say saber-tooth cat because it's not a cat, it's a marsupial, but there's a marsupial saber-tooth. There's also, what we call the marsupial lion. There are these very weird carnivorous things that have come out of marsupials. You also have, panda bears, right? So an herbivorous bear that's evolved from a carnivorous group of animals. That's sort of weird. But yeah, there's all sorts of neat examples.
I love that. I love that there's almost always an exception to the rule. And that, that concept of holding things lightly, it really does apply across disciplines, because as certain as you are about something, there's almost always something that sort of flies in the face of that. And of course, as I said before, like, I know it's as pithy as it is, life does or will attempt to find a way. And sometimes it gets real creative in its process of doing so. Like, for example, maybe there will be a future with a continued kind of growing population of Pizzly bears. Who knows? Who knows? I guess time will tell. So we've covered so many different topics over the course of this conversation. I've already kept you so much longer than I wanted to, but I got to know, like, what does a Pizzly look like? Does it look more like a grizzly, more like a polar? What features does it have of each? Or are they, all over?
Yeah. So if you can just imagine what it would look like for a polar bear and a grizzly to mate and sort of the outcome of that, that's exactly what a Pizzly is. So it's sort of a intermediate of all forms. And so its coloration of its hair is a little bit darker than a polar bear, lighter than a grizzly. It has less of a sort of a humped shaped back than a grizzly does, more elongated skull than a grizzly. So a little bit more similar to a polar bear, but really kind of smack dab in the middle. It really does look sort of intermediate in most forms, whether you're talking about its hair or whether you're talking about its even behavior. So some of them, so for example, there was a study done in Germany where they actually had two Pizzly cubs that were born out of a grizzly bear and a polar bear. And what they did is they immediately removed them from that zoo and they sent them to another zoo. And then they observe them. So this is, removing the teaching element that the mother would normally teach to her offspring. And in that zoo, they then observed them. And so, they looked at different, how they looked, but they also looked at how they behaved. And so, when they would lay down, they actually laid down much more similar to a polar bear. When they would swim, they were sort of intermediate. So they were better swimmers than grizzlies and not as good as polar bears. And so, it was pretty intermediate in form and in shape and also in size. So yeah, sort of what you would imagine.
I can imagine that you still would not want to come face to face with one of these bad boys in the wild. Like, they would still be horrifying to encounter, especially if they were protecting their young or hungry or any other situation in which you would not be well matched. That would be a David and Goliath situation, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I enjoy studying these animals from the safety of museum collections.
Yes.
That being said, it would be pretty amazing to actually see one in the wild. I still have not seen a polar bear in the wild, although I do hear of stories in certain regions where, kids are trick-or-treating and they have to keep an eye out for polar bears and things like that. So that's a whole other thing to worry about. Yep.
Yeah. From a safe distance, I say, from a safe distance. All right. So, Larisa, I was hoping that before we bid adieu and enjoy our Thanksgiving holidays, that we, because of course we're recording this time traveling a bit before it comes out, that I could ask you the same two questions that I ask all of the guests on the show. And they're really big picture questions. So are you ready to dive into them?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. So obviously, we've been talking a lot about climate change. That may actually be it's a very common answer to these questions, and that is okay. There's a good reason that it's a common answer, so whether your mind goes to that place or some other place, I want you to sort of think about whatever context is relevant to you right now, whether it be through your work, through your personal life, something very small and individualistic, or something very large and global or even cosmic, and tell us, number one, what is the thing that's keeping you up the most at night, the thing you're worried about, concerned about, you may be sort of bordering on disillusioned or cynical, or just the thing that's really, really concerning you. And then on the flip side of that, so that we do end on a more positive note, where are you finding your optimism these days? What are you looking forward to? What are you hopeful for?
Yeah, those are huge questions. So I will say, it's for a long time, it is very frustrating to sort of so often what I study is the megafaunal extinction, and I'm studying why these animals went extinct and what the consequences of these extinctions were. And what it sort of come down to is climate change or human hunting. And we are now living in a world in which humans are having both impacts, right? So when we were talking about climate change 10,000 years ago, we weren't talking about human-caused climate change. We were talking about glacial, interglacial cycling and sort of natural climate change. Today, we're actually talking about human-induced climate change, in addition to human-induced hunting, habitat fragmentation, changes in the landscape in many different ways, shapes, and forms, including fire and habitat modification. We are changing the environment in really remarkable ways and are definitely considered ecosystem engineers. But I think with that, we really have a responsibility to future generations. And, that includes thinking about climate change. That also includes thinking about pollutants and chemicals and contamination. I'm worried about, the climate change and aridification in certain regions. I grew up in California. I do a lot of work in Australia. Fire plays a huge role in these ecosystems. And as things become drier and you have more pronounced fires, that can really lead to lots of changes to those environments, and some of them not so great for us. And so it's important that we conserve, not just for the sake of conserving other species, but even from a very self-centric sort of perspective for the survival of our own species. It's important that we have clean water to drink and clean air to breathe, and that we have, a diversity of animals and resilient ecosystems for our own survival. So whether, it's a selfish perspective or whether it's a compassionate perspective, climate change and the impacts humans are having writ large on the environment is huge. I mean, I'm seeing the impacts from my studies on what natural climate change in the past, and also human impacts with far fewer humans on the landscape, how that wreaked havoc on communities and how that caused extinction of numerous large animals. And so, seeing this all kind of play out today is concerning.
Absolutely. And so where do you find your optimism and your hope? Where are you able to focus sort of a genuine and authentic positive outlook?
So it's funny, because you wouldn't think that saber-toothed cats would be the place that I would find some sort of solace or escape. But it looks like even saber-toothed cats were pretty compassionate. And I really think that we need to, as a species, we need to really care for each other. And for example, in studying these saber-toothed cats, one of the things we found was that there are different individuals that will actually have a broken saber, and that bone sort of fills in and remodels in that area. And these saber-toothed cats are able to survive for some period of time without having, this hunting apparatus. Well, what that means is that other cats in the landscape are likely caring for them. And there's amazing footage of a female taking down, can't remember if it was a buffalo or wildebeest, but it was a large ungulate, and opening up its sort of belly so that this other lioness with a broken jaw can feed from that. And so I think that even in the most dire of circumstances, if we come together as a species, there are things that we can do to help each other. And I think we need to not forget to be compassionate. The other thing that keeps me going is I work at a university. And so there are lots of young people that I'm working with, and seeing their passion and their energy and their enthusiasm and their desire to make the world a better place, that keeps me going. That is our future.
Absolutely. Dr. Larisa DeSantis, thank you so much for taking the time today, for teaching us all about paleontology, all about the interesting mechanisms that you use to study both extinct and extant species, and of course, all about the Pizzly bear.
Thanks so much for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Absolutely. And for everyone listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.